Blessings, beloveds. Anastasia, Cosmic Astrologer with you. Welcome back to my channel. And happy Easter to everybody who's celebrating Easter this week as well. A beautiful symbolism, Easter. Just going on a different point here at the moment. But, you know, Easter is so symbolic of the Christ consciousness, Christ's light, coming into our fields. It's always there anyway, but certainly at times like this, it seems to be highly activated, the energy. So if you're into that, if you're into activating energies, this is a beautiful time. And of course, it's, you know, we've just gone through the equinox. So spring for you guys in the other part of the hemisphere, and it's autumn here for us. So it's a lot of new energy coming through, so hopefully you're able to tap into that and work it with your level of awareness and consciousness, so that it can serve you and serve your higher self. Alright guys, so today's video is going to be focused on the moon in the chart, but with a very specific angle that unless you're a very advanced astrologer, you probably won't know about this particular technique, and how important it is, how valid it is, how useful it is, how powerful it is, how revealing it is. I will talk about what that is in a moment, and I guess before I do, I just want to summarize very briefly what does the moon symbolize in the birth chart. Most of you know, most of you have an understanding about that, but I will just give a brief summary just to introduce the energy of the moon, to remind us of why it's actually so important, and particularly with the particular method or technique that I'm going to share with you today, so that when you are looking at your own chart, or when you are looking at somebody else's chart, test this out, try it out, have a look at it, and see what it reveals to you and what meaning you can find around that. So the moon is, you know, it's such an important light in the chart, and it is a light, just as the sun, the solar energy, is a light as well. The moon's light, though, is very different to that of the sun. First of all, the moon is a subjective energy, so it's all internal. The moon is our pre-ego state, which that in itself is really quite telling. If we think about our birth chart as a blueprint of our life, in the sense of the soul has chosen particular patterns that it wishes to work through and evolve through, then the moon is essentially a vehicle that the soul expresses through. Okay, so it is pre-ego, and it is very much related to past patterns, subjective emotional patterns, responses and reactions, family, a number of different things, which I'll give you some further key words. But let's just start with the moon rules the sign of Cancer. It rules the fourth house, in terms of the fourth being the Cancerian house. The moon ruling Cancer. Cancer is a water sign. It's the first water sign out of the trinity of the three water signs. So we have Cancer, Scorpio, and Pisces. So Cancer represents our first encounter with the element of water. So it's the birth of water, if you like. It's the birth of that first internal subjective encounter of the emotional self and our pre-ego self. So it's the first form that begins of our pre-ego subconscious state through the element of water. So the moon is we can use this analogy, the moon is the lens that the soul projects through to create the form and the personality of you, of yourself, of this subjective self. The self begins at Aries, which is the ascendant. Aries is the first house. So that is the emergence of self. But it's literally the emergence of self, the emergence of the ID, the id, pre-ego. Who was it? Not Carl Jung, Freud. Freud coined that term id and pre-ego. So we start at Aries, and that's the birth of you, and then we start to get the first sense of the physical, the physical body, if you like, the physical component of who you are in the world. And once we get to Gemini, it's our first, sorry, let me just go back to Taurus. So Taurus is the first encounter of the physical. Taurus is the first earth sign. So it's that our first experience of our physical, of our senses, you know, so eating, smelling, tasting, touching, and so forth. It's our first encounter of those senses, of that experience of the physical body. That's what Taurus rules. That's why Taurus has such incredibly strong senses on all levels. And Gemini is our first encounter with speech and language, our vocal cords rather. So our first encounter of communication, which is why Geminis, you know, are often chatterboxes. They love to chat. You know, this is why. It's when you follow through in the entire zodiac, and you begin at Aries and you follow through each sign, you're actually, what you're witnessing is the development of what we call the individuation process of the human being. So each sign represents a very distinct stage of our evolution, our individuation. When we get to Cancer, as I said, it's the first experience of water, of emotions. So it's subjective, it's incredibly private and personal. It's that first encounter of emotional responses and reactions to our environment and what's going on around us. It's that first encounter of that emotional world. So as a result of that, Cancer really sets up our emotional security or our emotional vulnerabilities. It's, as I said, it's subjective. It connects to our needs of security, emotions. It is the nurturing principle. It connects to family and clans. It's our roots, it's our home, family, it's the womb, it's our early child environment and experiences. So it's the, as I said, it's the ego as well, and the ego's self-image that's projected. Okay, so the soul is one and unto itself, if you like. However, for the soul to have a vehicle to express itself through in this physical incarnation in this 3D world, it needs a vehicle, it needs something to project through, and that's what the moon serves. It serves as a projective function, all right, which is why it's actually completely subjective to begin with. Now, it's how we become, the moon is how we become consciously aware of our subjective self. It's what it, pardon me, it's what enables that subjective self to become conscious, if you like. The moon also represents the womb. It's mother. The moon is always mother. It's the feminine principle, the divine mother, you could say as well. Depends on, you know, which level we're actually looking through in terms of the various levels of astrological lenses as well. But I'm just trying to keep it very simple. I just want to stick to some key sort of themes and key words for what the moon represents, so that we can just go into that space and get a sense of the moon's energy, and how important it is in terms of how it actually shapes very much the journey that we experience through the soul. The moon acts like a container, so it holds everything together. It also points to the structure of our personality that is formed as we evolve through our journey. So the fourth house in your birth chart, the sign on the fourth house cusp, the ruler of that fourth house, the sign of your moon, the location of your moon, and any aspects it has is your basic point of delineating what the moon means for you in your life. That's the general framework that one uses when they're wanting to understand what the moon shows in the individual's chart. Okay, so the moon essentially describes the nature of the emotional dynamics that occur within us. Now, I want to make a very clear distinction here with feelings and emotions. First of all, feelings are something that are experienced at a much deeper level to what emotions are. So feelings take us quite deep inside because they connect to a feeling of love, of loving somebody or loving something. Whereas emotions actually stir us up. When you break down the word emotion, emotion, when you look to the root meaning of that word, it literally means to be disturbed or to be taken out of yourself or out of your center. So that's what emotions do. That's what the moon does. Our moon is an incredibly sensitive point in the chart because it is where we are triggered and where we react to situations or to people, circumstances, and so forth. It is an instinctual, subjective reaction to circumstances, hence why it's a trigger point. Whereas feelings are more a Venus aspect or experience. Venus is very much about love and appreciation and values and things like that. So when we really love something and really connect to something on that level, it's a Venus experience. Those deeper feelings are a Venus experience. And, Venus is said to be the lower octave of Neptune. Neptune being the entirety of divine love. Well, Venus is an expression of that Neptune, just in a lower sort of way, if you like. It's more the birth and the emergence of that love that we feel for ourselves and for each other, of course, and for the collective at large. But the expansion of that is Neptune. So hopefully you can get a sense of the distinction I'm making between emotions and feelings. They sit in very different places in the world and within us. So the moon is connected to our emotions, our emotional state. Our emotional states are the states that we experience where we feel disrupted and disturbed in some kind of way. Whereas feelings go into a deeper component within us that are actually more stable and centered. Okay, so that's the distinction between feelings and emotions, and it's important to understand that. So the moon is our emotions. The moon essentially is our sense of security, whether we feel secure within ourselves, secure in life, and what sort of insecurities we do have, this is what the moon shows you. Because the moon connects to early childhood. So your early upbringing, family, mother and father, and the family that you grew up in, the dynamics that were occurring in your family home. And it is true from many branches of perspectives, including astrology, that, you know, the first 7 years of our physical life very much shape and determine what we will encounter and experience later on in life. So the first 7 years shape our ego, you know, our sense of security, our self-worth, you know, all those things, our core beliefs, you know, about ourself and about life. That is all shaped in the first 7 years of life. That's ruled by the moon. So depending on, you know, what sort of family environment we grew up in, whether we had the nurturance and the support and the sense of security, which is all the moon, is determined by the moon in your chart. If our security was not nurtured and fostered and developed in those early years of life, then it is typical that we will experience a sense of destabilization throughout our life emotionally when it comes to any matter to do with security. And the problem with that is that the way the world is shaped in terms of the 3D world out there and what is imprinted in our psyche and what is fed to us through the external world is that, and it's a misconception, is that our security is achieved through what we achieve out there. For example, you know, what sort of job we have, or whether we have a job, or whether we have a career, or whether we have money in the bank, or whether we own property, you know, all those sorts of external things. You know, we get fed back to us that security comes from these things. So the more you can attain those external things, you will always feel secure, or you will have a greater sense of security. And I think most of us can identify and recognize that really isn't very true at all. You know, that certainly adds layers of experience or layers of wisdom or insight to our life, or richness to our life, but it doesn't serve as the dominant primary vehicle to security. Why? Simply because any of those things are subject to change, or can completely be taken away from you at any given moment, which is beyond your control. So if we are identifying our sense of security for who we are in our life through these external experiences, we will be constantly left feeling extremely vulnerable, because there is no certainty in any of those things in terms of how long one can have this or have that, etc. So in reality, our ultimate sense of security has to come from within, okay? And this is what the moon describes. So the initial experience of the moon can be a great sense of insecurity, unless, of course, it is, you know, fostered and nurtured and developed, that, you know, that taking place in the first early years of life, which sets up a pretty strong psychological and emotional template that you are safe in the world, that you are secure in the world, because you actually have it already within you. It's been instilled within you. So the moon is very, very powerful, as you can see. I'm only just, you know, pointing to some things. I could spend hours talking about this. but clearly I won't, not today. Okay, now what I want to just finish up with, which is the primary reason for this video, is that in ancient astrology, which I have studied, and I do work with certain principles and techniques of ancient astrology because I personally see the value in it, and I do see that there are certain components of it that are extremely powerful. It's just a matter of understanding how to use it. Now, this tip that I'm going to give you it's not super difficult, but if you are a beginner in astrology, you might struggle a little bit to get your head around it, but just take some time with it and listen very carefully to what I'm about to share with you so that you can think about it, reflect on it, and start to work with it. Because in astrology, you know, there's obviously a fundamental base and wisdom to how and why astrology works. But the greatest way to learn about astrology, and this is how I learned through the person who taught me as well, and he's been practicing astrology for almost 45 years, and he still does this very thing today, because he understands and knows that there's an infinite amount of wisdom and truth. So there is no end point when it comes to studying astrology. You don't reach a point, in my view anyway, where you say, okay, I got it, now I know everything. There is no such thing. It's a constant process of learning and evolution and development and growth, as it is in life as well. So the best way that you can learn astrology is to look at charts, okay? Look at charts and look at life circumstances. So if there's something going on in a particular person's life, whether it's you know, somebody in the public, or whether it's somebody that you know in your personal life, punch up a chart, pull up a chart, have a look at where is that story coming from in their chart. This is how you learn astrology. It's very powerful. And I've got an awesome example which I'm going to do another video on, which is about the power of eclipses and something kind of new. Not new, but anyway, I'll leave that for the other video, okay? So going back to this current video and what I would recommend you do. Now, when you were born, the moon was in a particular location, okay? And it was in a particular sign, and it was forming particular aspects to the planets in the chart, right? There is a method that is known as the moment that you were born. What happens the moment you were born is that we freeze the chart. You know, we take a picture. That's why you've got a chart in front of you and nothing's moving, because we've literally taken a photograph of the heavens, right, of the night sky and where everything was located. But in actual fact and in reality, for lack of a better word, nothing stops moving. You know, you were born at 10:30 p.m. Okay, the heavens didn't stop moving, the planets didn't stop moving when you were born. We just take a picture, a snapshot of those particular patterns, which are essentially a blueprint. So you were born at 10:30 and your moon was located in a particular position. Well, a second later, everything moved, you know, to a certain extent, depending on its cycle, etc. I mean, the fastest moving bodies is the moon, okay, and obviously outside of planets, the fastest moving points are the angles in the chart, and that changes and differs with certain signs rising in the east in the northern hemisphere and southern hemisphere. Some rising signs are faster in the northern hemisphere, and some of them are faster in the southern hemisphere. So there's a lot of different things to understand about this. But anyway, the moment you were born, you've got a snapshot of your chart. You can see where the moon was. You can see what sign it's in. You can see what aspects it's making. What you need to look at is the moment after your birth. What is the very next aspect that the moon, while you've been born, you're alive, you're breathing, you're here, and as everything continues to travel and move, you need to look at what is the very first aspect that the moon will make to any particular planet in your chart. That first aspect that the moon will make is a very, 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 I can't emphasize how powerful and important that particular aspect is. Now, it's this aspect is probably not in your chart when you're just looking at your chart for your time of birth, because this aspect occurs after your birth. Okay, so I'll just give you a visual example of what I mean to hopefully make this a bit clearer. All right, so here's your ascendant, IC, MC, descendant. Here's your moon. I've placed it in Aries in the 12th house, actually, just above the ascendant, okay? And I've just drawn in some other planets, and I'll explain what everything is doing here. Let me just double check. Okay, so say this was you. Say you had moon in Aries, and when you were born, the moon was opposite Neptune. Can you see that? Moon opposite Neptune. Neptune in Libra, moon in Aries. That's a direct opposition in the 12th and 6th house. Okay. Now, I've got the moon at 5 degrees of Aries. That's important. Take note of that. And Neptune, I have at 3 degrees of Libra. Okay, there's only 2 degrees separating this opposition, which means it's a very close opposition. But what it also means is that the moon and Neptune were in an exact opposition before you were born, because the moon has moved past the opposition of Neptune. Neptune's at 3, the moon's at 5. If the moon's at 5, 5 is higher than 3, isn't it? So the moon has moved past that opposition, but nevertheless it's still there. It's a very powerful opposition in your birth chart. The next aspect I want to bring your attention to is the Pluto in Capricorn up here at this part of the chart, okay? And Pluto is at 4 degrees of Capricorn, okay? So again, what we have here is we have Pluto square the moon in Aries. Aries is square Capricorn, okay? The moon is at 5 degrees, therefore it's above 4 degrees of Capricorn. So again, in this example, the moon was actually square Pluto before you were born in terms of its exactness. However, this square is extremely powerful. It's only a degree apart, okay? So those two aspects are there in your natal birth chart when you were born. Now, what happens is, as you can see down here in the 4th house, I have put Saturn in Cancer, which creates a square to the moon in Aries. I have put Saturn at 10 degrees. Okay, now you can see that 10 degrees, well, you can understand as well, 10 degrees is 5 degrees past the 5 degrees of the moon in Aries. So what that means is that there is a square here already in place, okay? But this square hasn't actually taken its full form yet, because the moon still has to reach up to 10 degrees before it becomes exact. And as a matter of fact, to make things a little bit more, or to give you more understanding, you could have Saturn at 15 degrees. okay, instead of 10. That means that the moon squaring Saturn is actually 10 degrees away. Now, there are different views and norms and rules on the orbs that one should use, okay? And that's something that you need to explore yourself. Maybe I'll do a video on that one day, just explaining the power of orbs. An orb is basically what is the distance between one point to another. So in this case, it's 10 degrees apart. Now, traditionally, some astrologers might use an orb in relation to a square aspect of up to 8 degrees, okay, as opposed to 10 degrees. 10 degrees might be considered too wide for some. It may not for others. But let me now make it even, wider. Let me make it 18 degrees, which is, what's that? That's 15. That's sorry, I've lost my maths. 5, 10. Oh, sorry, my brain's gone a bit numb. Let's just keep it at 15. The point I'm trying to make is, even though this square is that the orb is quite big, this aspect is very, very powerful, because in terms of your birth chart, your moon is squaring Pluto opposite Neptune, very wide square to Saturn, but this aspect hasn't actually kicked in yet, okay? This is the aspect that's going to kick in after your birth. So in other words, because the moon travels very, very quickly, okay, so the moon will move through Aries. It takes 2 days to go through a sign, okay? So it's at 5 degrees. I've got Saturn at 15, okay? So 10 degrees away, that's about a day or something like that, okay? When the moon reaches 15 degrees and it's exactly square Saturn, well, then that's an exact square. Now, what is the point of all of that? This is the point. That square to the moon that I just showed you from Saturn, that is considered to be the next aspect that the moon is going to make after your birth, irrespective of the aspects that are there natally. Now, why is this important? It's important because it seems to set up an incredibly strong psychological template